So unless you've been living under a rock for the past 10 years or so, you've likely heard many news reports from various media outlets about the obesity crisis that we're facing as a society. And so it's this obesity crisis that I want to define and explore a little bit in this section. And so as an American, I think it's okay that I say this, but we all know that Americans are the most overweight country, right? So we are, on average, not a healthy people, right? We're known for our fast food and our sedentary lifestyle. So many drive-thrus around the country, right? The stereotype is that we don't even want to get out of the cars to get our food. Hashtag not all Americans, we know that, right? But on average, what this data indicates, and I'll show some more recent data soon, that increasingly Americans are obese and overweight, and so we can see that that's gone up since the 1990s up until 2010, and such that in some parts of the country 30% or more of the population is obese. But stereotypes aside, right, so the data does support this, that Americans are becoming increasingly overweight. And while it's nice to have a neighbor that you can look down on and be better than, Canada's not doing too much better, right? So here's some data from 2011. It takes a long time to collect this data, so often it doesn't come out till several years later, but this is looking at obesity rates in North America. So we've got the US and Canada here on the same map, and so you can see certainly the US is a darker red, indicating more obesity than in Canada, but there's still relatively high rates, particularly in certain provinces of Canada, so the highest areas being Newfoundland. I never say that right, so please forgive me. I'm a dumb American. Okay. Expanding this to look more globally now and at some more recent data, there's this really excellent recent website and article that goes with it that came out where you can use some really cool interactive charts to look at how rates of overweight and obesity have changed around the world since 1975. And so here what I'm showing you is the percent of adults that are obese by country in 2016. This is the most recent data that I've been able to find. And so what we can see here is following what we saw before, right? So we're seeing about 40%, to be precise, it's 36% obese in the US in 2016 compared to only 11.9% in 1975. In Canada, the obesity rate is 29% overall in 2016, and that's up from 9.8% in 1975 as well. And so if you are interested in knowing about any other countries, you can go to this website. I've got it linked on our weekly page, and it's really cool interactive graphics. It really shows how a good graphic can give us information really easily and quickly. This is from the same website, right, just to show us this a little bit differently. This is now the share of adults who are overweight or obese. And I'm going to define those terms more specifically in just a moment when we get into talking about body mass index and what the cutoffs are for overweight and obese. But what this is showing here, that if we combine these two categories and we look at the US, now we've got even more of a percent overweight, right? Now we're up into the above 70%, and in Canada, we're in the 60s. In terms of percentages here, right? And so clearly this is what people are referring to when they're talking about this obesity crisis, that these numbers are going, that these numbers are high and that they're going up quickly, that this has changed pretty drastically, right? 1975 might seem like a really long time ago, but that's less than a lifetime. And so this is a really critical thing to be concerned about as health psychologists, because as we'll see, being overweight certainly is related to some negative health outcomes. But that said, I do want to just complicate this a little bit, right? When we look at those numbers, that might be a little bit galling, like really 67% is overweight. And this is because in part of the cutoffs we have for BMI. And so, to be considered overweight, you need to have a body mass index of between 25 and 29.9, so right before 30, which is when we start classifying people as obese. And you can calculate your BMI. You can do it with math if you'd like. I recommend just doing a quick Google search for a BMI calculator. There's a million on online and you can figure out what your body mass index is. And so when I do mine using a calculator, of course, I suppose I could do it by hand if I drew on my old math skills, you can calculate your BMI. You can also use this chart here. It's probably hard to see on your end, but I'm 5'11", so you can follow yourself over there and find your weight, and I'm 185 pounds. And so this puts me squarely into this overweight category at the BMI of about 25 or 26. And so, and this is something that has been a recent thing that's brought up in criticisms of the way that we calculate being overweight and being obese with this body mass index, right? So, certainly I could be more fit. There's things I could do to be in better shape, but by most people's definitions, you wouldn't really think of me as being overweight. And so as we'll see, many people get classified into this category who really are quite healthy. And in fact, many pro athletes have a BMI that's in the mid to high 20s. And this is because when we're calculating BMI in this way, right, we're basing it just on your height and your weight. And while certainly having more fat than as opposed to no fat is going to add weight to your body, there's also all kinds of other things that can add weight. Some people have denser bones than others, and certainly muscle adds weight. And so while this is very quick and dirty tool, right? It's an easy way to categorize people. Data on height and weight is easily available, right? You give it to the Department of Motor Vehicles when you get your license, and so this is something that's easy to calculate around the world, but it may not be the best indicator of health. And so yeah, there's certainly measurement issues with this, right? So the formula, as I said, is just based on your weight and your height. And it doesn't take into account anything else about your physicality or where you're carrying that weight. I've had this tweet for a while now that I keep in this lecture, but yeah, this was about a couple different athletes, right, that have the same body mass index as Trump, right? They're the same height and they have the same weight, but clearly they're in a very different level of fitness and are likely to have different health outcomes because of that. And so certainly this is one way to look at the mass of people's bodies, right? But that's all it's giving you is their mass. It's not telling you what that mass is made up of. And so there's a huge range of body types and fitnesses that can fit within a BMI category. And so if you're interested in knowing more about that, there's this really cool website on Flickr that just has all these different people who post photos of themselves and what their BMI is. And so you can search by BMI and just see the whole range of people that have that BMI. And there's just all different kinds of body shapes within that. And so again, just to highlight the point that while this is one way, it's one correlate of health, right? Certainly on average, having a higher BMI, particularly when you get into that obese category, is related to poor health outcomes, particularly related to diabetes. It doesn't mean that that's necessarily the case, right? We also want to look at other factors when we're considering individual risk. And indeed, studies show that BMI is not a great predictor of health. This study comes from Janet Tomiyama, who you read about a bit in the article from the book by Tracy Mann. She was one of her former students and has gone on to be just an incredible researcher on public health, eating, weight, dieting, and its impact particularly on women. And so they did a study where they looked at people's BMI and what that led them to be classified. So were they classified as normal weight? Were they classified as overweight? Were they classified as obese? And then they actually brought them into the lab. In this case, it's like an exercise lab with all kinds of physiology equipment, and they measure actual indicators of their health, like their blood pressure and their blood glucose levels, which, as we'll learn a bit later in this lecture, is an important indicator of metabolic health. And so among other things like heart rate. And so they actually look at, do you seem healthy? And so then they compared healthiness to the category that people were put in based on their BMI. And what they found is that 15% of people who are categorized as obese are physiologically very healthy, right? So this is certainly a smaller percent than people of normal weight, but this is still a vast number of people, right? That's a very significant proportion are perfectly healthy on these physiological measures. Whereas 30% of normal weight people are unhealthy on these physiological measures, right? They might have a BMI that puts them in that normal weight category, but maybe they have really high blood pressure or high blood glucose or a really high resting heart rate. And so, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're healthy because you're normal weight. I really don't love that term, but that's the one they use, so that's why I keep putting it in quotes. Right, so again, just to point out that this is not a great indicator of health, right? If we still, even in this study, if we take the average, of course there's going to be a correlation between BMI and health, but that correlation is not as strong as many public health messages might lead us to believe. So are there better measures then, right? We keep using BMI. What else could we or should we be using? And certainly there are better measures, right? So looking at hip to waist ratio already improves this, improves as a metric in terms of being able to predict health outcomes. And so with hip to waist ratio, right, we're looking now not just at your mass, but also how it's distributed on your body. And as Sapolsky talks about in the reading, having more weight distributed on your abdomen, or what they call visceral fat, is more strongly related to negative health outcomes. Carrying weight around your butt and thighs is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, particularly for women, that can be very adaptive. That's what we need to form the brains of babies. And so there really is what we call good fat and bad fat. And so looking at hip to waist ratio can give us an indicator of how much mass and fat we're carrying on our abdomen, and that tends to be a better predictor of long-term health outcomes compared to BMI. I have it listed here as tape measures, but literally what they do when you, if you've ever joined a new gym and before you're allowed to use any of the equipment, they want to do a whole health assessment on you. And I'm like, I know, I'm unhealthy. Please don't measure my non-existent muscles. They're like, let's measure your arms and your, your waist and your hips, but then also other, parts of your body. And so we can get a sense of more of the distribution of fat on your body, right? And so we're getting as well as the distribution of muscle, right? So with each of these steps, we're basically getting more information about the composition of your body and how much of that is fat relative to muscle. We can use what they call skin calipers. Some gyms use this too. And this is basically, they just kind of squeeze you to see how much extra there is there. And so this is also another way that can give us an indication not just of the mass of your body, but what that mass is composed of. We're seeing more and more attempts with scales as well that try to estimate the composition of body fat. Some of those are better than others. I wouldn't trust it unless it's being used by a professional, but that is something that people are working hard on. Probably the gold standard is what we call hydrostatic weighing, and this is essentially takes advantage of physics that I don't fully understand, but they submerge you in water, and then you can see how much water is displaced, but also knowing the weight of the person, we can determine more about the makeup of the composition of the body. So again, what's the distribution of fat versus muscle versus other components of the body? I guess bones. What else is left? You can tell I'm not truly a physiologist. But so if there's all these other measures, right, why do we continue to use BMI? Well, because it's easy, right? This data is mass available, and so it would be much more difficult to, run a study where you went all around the world and collected all this information from individuals all around the world to get the kind of map that I showed early on here. That shouldn't be used as an excuse, however, right? So certainly we can use BMI to know the fact that people are getting heavier. That trend is clearly there regardless, but it is important when we're thinking about individual health that we consider other factors. And I highlight this a lot because this has been really important to public policy, and I'm more aware of what's been going on in the U.S. with that since I'm still relatively new to Canada. But for example, in the U.S., they're measuring BMI at schools, and they're sending notes home with kids about their need for exercise. But many kids have a BMI that puts them in that unhealthy range, but that's because they're growing, right? They're about to have a growth spurt. They might have a little extra fat on them because of that. Also, some kids just have a lot more muscle than other kids, and so So it's become a very shaming thing that they're doing, and basically telling these kids that they're unhealthy and that they're fat, when really they, in many cases, are very healthy kids. And even if they're not, this is not the way to be telling them that and to be sending notes home like that about that. And so this is something that not just with children, but also I teach about this a bit in my org behavior class, but many, because in the U.S., insurance is covered by your workplace. Many workplaces now, as part of their wellness program, will give you a discount if you have a BMI that puts you in that normal weight category, and will charge people more if they're in that overweight category, even though we just saw that that doesn't necessarily mean that you're less healthy and therefore likely to cost that insurance more. So again, this really does have how we measure these things, and the message we send around how that's linked to health really has important implications for people's lives. Yeah, and then I guess the best thing, if we want to understand health, we could actually measure indicators of health, right? So this would be my argument, that rather than focusing on what's the composition of the body, because certainly individuals vary in that, as we'll see, for genetic reasons as well as for lifestyle reasons, looking at, can people move their body around in ways that are adaptive and can they go about their daily life, and do they feel fit? Are they able to do activities that get their heart rate up, right? We could actually look at indicators of health as well as like they did in Janet Tomayama's study, where they looked at your blood pressure and your heart rate, right? And so really looking at those as indicators of health and making decisions based on that rather than the mass of someone's body. I'm going to pause there, and then we'll pick back up with talking about some of the biological factors that impact eating and weight.